In the last video, we've seen how the lockdown caused by the coronavirus epidemic has caused a decrease in pollution, especially in the cities, and especially a decrease in emissions in general. This seemed to be an amazing news, but we've also analyzed how things went in the past economic crisis, and we've seen that it's very normal that the emissions go down, but right after the first month of the crisis, they go back and they increase even more. We've also formulated the hypothesis that this crisis is different than the past ones because of cultural turns that happen in our Western society in the past decade and because of the new habits that the pandemic has forced us into. So this crisis has really the potential to become the new green turn in the history of humanity. This potential needs to be recognized and be developed, and who has the last word on that are the governments. So the governments at the moment have the immense power of deciding of the future of this planet. The term crisis comes from the ancient Greek krisis, which comes from the verb krinein. Krinein meant to divide, separate, evaluate, reflect, and judge. So in these terms, crisis means really a moment where you have to divide your path and choose which way to go. In our case, the COVID crisis means to either go towards the environmentally friendly trends that we've seen in the past few years and take the path of a green turn of our economies, or it means to go back to the situation that we had previous to the crisis, completely ignoring the positive chances that this terrible crisis has brought us. The oil industry has been hit very hard by this crisis. The oil demand decreased by 5% in the first quarter of 2020, and the electricity demand decreased up to 20% in full lockdown countries. As a consequence of this drop in demand, the prices of oil dropped down incredibly. They have reached the lowest level of the past 20 years. This whole situation is causing that the storage facilities of oil are full, and in some cases they are even trying to get rid of the oil. And numerous oil wells have already closed because the cost of transportation is higher than the price of oil at the moment. What we need to consider here is that oil wells are not exactly like a tap that you can turn on or off whenever you want. Because of the pressure technology often used in this process of extraction of the oil, it is extremely expensive to interrupt the extraction itself. And sometimes it's even damaging for the well too. And it's also very expensive to restart this process once the crisis is gone. That's why for those oil fields that decided to stop the production, the consequences are gonna be very damaging for the companies, and that's also why some of these oil fields decided to continue their production, which is what is happening in Wyoming, United States, and in Alberta, Canada, where the companies are literally willing to pay someone to get rid of the oil. In the meantime, Saudi Arabia and Russia are two countries that have decided to face the problem by increasing their production. So because the prices are so low, they increase the production in order to reach the same levels of revenue. And these are also the two countries that are battling for the market at the moment. By this little picture that I just described you can understand how the oil market is showing itself as a very vulnerable and unstable market. In fact, banks, large funds, and capital markets are cutting financing for these oil projects at the moment. Even the Norwegian National Fund, which is huge, has been cutting financing. That the oil market is very unstable and vulnerable, it's certainly not news in the recent history, but the news this time is that its direct concurrent, which is the market of renewable energies, has become massively cheaper than it was in the past decades. For example, in the crisis of 2008. At that time, there was so much talking about a green turn of the economy, but nothing happened because the renewables were still very, very expensive technologies. But after 12 years of technological advancements, nowadays renewable sources are much cheaper to implement. Also, the market of renewables has a very unique advantage. They require less investments. And about the returns, although they are not as spectacular as in the oil market, they're certainly more solid and reliable. Paul Flood of the Newton Investment Management prefers renewables because they have the uniqueness of remaining stable even in very turbulent economic moments. And this observation is certainly confirmed by the latest global energy review of the International Energy Agency, which reported that in the first quarter of 2020, renewables were the only source that posted a growth in demand, driven by larger installed capacity and priority dispatch. And even in the scenario picture for the rest of 2020, renewables demand is expected to increase because of low operating costs and preferential access to many power systems. Even Jeff Curry of Goldman Sachs, which is really not an institution known for its environmental engagement, believes that the oil industry won't be able to keep up the spike in oil prices next year and will leave a gap for renewables. Not all points of view are so optimistic, there are pessimistic positions too. Based on my researches, they mainly revolve on the fact that the lower prices in oil will determine an incremented consumption of the oil itself. And if you allow me for a moment a small personal opinion, I think this position is kind of short-viewed. This is certainly going to be true in the first few months, but what about what's going to happen in the long term? Even Martin Gratz, oil strategist at Morgan Stanley, claimed that the oil demand is likely to remain lower than in the past, which doesn't mean that we are not going to use oil anymore. Of course, oil will remain in the next decade an essential source of energy, but our goal is to decrease its consumption, not to eliminate it. It's more or less, if you allow me a little bit of a weird comparison, it's a bit like the COVID epidemic curve, right? Our goal was not to stop the epidemic because that was kind of impossible. Our goal was to flatten the curve so that the hospitals and the medical staff would have time to process all the cases. In the same way, it's not that the oil is the devil. The oil is an amazing resource. The problem is that we are abusing it. So we are consuming it so much that the plants, the seaweed in the oceans, and all these natural elements that we have on the planet that filter the air and make sure that the atmosphere will remain a safe place for humans, will have time and resources enough to process the residues of this consumption of oil. I hope I explained myself clear enough. There is a good chance that the year 2019 will be remembered in history as the year of the peak of CO2 emissions. Sure, the governments are now the entities that have the power to tax emissions and to limit them, to keep them low. So they certainly have a historic opportunity. They just need to realize that. And countries of North America, unfortunately, has definitely not realized that because they have started already on the wrong foot. In the US, of the $2 trillion for the pandemic relief package, 60 billion of that have given to airline companies. And on top of that, the government is giving low-interest loans to all companies without requiring any action in terms of environmental protection in exchange of that. Also, Canada is not really giving a very good example with $2.5 billion given as oil and gas companies bailout. It is easy, in my opinion, to go back to the system how it was working before the crisis. It is certainly the easiest, quickest, and most obvious, if you want, choice that a government could make. Think about a person who is a smoker, right? 2 packs a day. And suddenly, out of the blue, he finds himself in a certain condition for which he cannot smoke. For 2 months straight, he's struggling so much, he hates the situation, he's so miserable, he thinks his world has come to an end, he feels like he's wanna die. Those 2 months come to an end. He can finally go back to his normal life. He can finally smoke again. The quickest, easiest, and simplest option is to go back to his pack of cigarettes and start smoking 2 packs a day again, right? But that terrible situation also had brought him the potential to change something in his life, right? Something radical. So those governments who decide to implement a green turn in their economy in this post-lockdown phase will have to invest a little bit more time and effort probably than those economies who just want to go back to how things were up to 3 months ago. But the pandemic has been a huge real-life experiment that has given us so many examples of how our cities could turn into more sustainable systems. And this was such an important event because people tend to reflect and decide more consciously when they find themselves in new situations or when they find themselves to face old problems in new situations. So in the cities, for example, the epidemic has definitely shown the importance of green areas. An extension of green areas would mean less space for cars and more space for pedestrians and bicycles. It would mean more biodiversity. It could create the opportunity of producing local food. Here in New York, for example, the lockdown has certainly shown how much space for the cars there is in the streets versus the space for pedestrians. The fact that the sidewalks are so small in comparison to the lanes for the cars is not something to be given for granted. And what about the parking space then? In fact, during this lockdown, so many areas of New York has been closed to the traffic and open for pedestrians and cyclists. And very recently, so many parking lots have been reserved to socializing for people instead of parking cars. The pandemic has also transformed the bicycle into the best meaning of transportation in the cities because it's the safest and healthiest one. Speaking of which, certain cities are implementing big projects of cycling infrastructure. Milan, for example, is giving a wonderful example with 35 kilometers of bike lanes that they are actually building, taking space from the streets out of the cars for the bicycles.
Ciclabile, linea d'arresto più avanti rispetto alla linea d'arresto delle auto. Quelli invece sono posteggi per le moto, perché di solito posteggiano qua le moto, così in teoria c'è più spazio per i pedoni. Ma non è finita, andiamo avanti.
Who influences the governments in these decisions? Who pushes the governments to go towards a green turn or to go back to a carbon-based economy? First of all is the public opinion, for sure, and public opinion is made by the sum of the opinions of single citizens and the pressure that they make to the governments. Then obviously big companies, big corporations make a lot of pressure on the governments. And the third source of influence are the diplomatic relationships with other governments. The environmental diplomacy has always been the engine of the government's actions towards environmental protection. And right now, because of the COVID, is not doing well. The 2020 United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, was supposed to take place in Glasgow, Scotland in November, and it's obviously been postponed. Also, the 2020 United Nations Biodiversity Conference was supposed to take place this fall in Yunnan, China, and it's also been postponed. The fourth and last session of the UN Conference on the Law of Sea was supposed to take place in New York City in April-March this year. It's obviously been cancelled. Also, the Urban Future Global Conference, which is Europe's largest event for sustainable cities, was supposed to take place in Lisbon, Portugal in April. At least the European Union has been going through the European Green Deal, which is aiming to cut the emissions by 50% by 2030. I don't know about you, but I feel that this time the possibility of a green turn is so close that I really want to give my contribution, spend some time and effort on it. And I know how many of you are feeling. You're feeling like you as single individuals cannot do anything about this. This is such a huge problem, it's too big for each one of us. But deep down, we all know that this is false. All changes start with the first small step. All big storms start with a few drops of rain. And I have a very concrete and effective action that you can do right now to give your contribution to this cause. Once upon a time, with my couchsurfing trips, I ended up staying with a host that was a very special person. He was a big environmental activist for the oceans. And during those 2-3 days that I stayed at his place, he was obviously super busy, but at a certain point I managed to take him for a walk with me and ask him some questions about sustainability, and especially I asked him how can individual citizens do something concrete about this problem. And in his 20-30 years of environmental activism, he gave me an answer that I was really not expecting, and it really surprised me. He told me that of all the things that he's tried, there is one that is the most effective of all: writing letters to people who have the power to change things. He said that this is the biggest power that individual citizens have, because they have the possibility to make pressures on politicians, on CEOs of companies, on people who really make the big decisions, who are really on top of the pyramid of power. So for you who made it to the end of this video, I'm gonna leave a list of email contacts down below in the description. Please go there, choose 1 or 2 or 3 and send them a very quick email. It's gonna take you literally 5 minutes. Just ask to these politicians and their collaborators to work hard and to push their colleagues to reorganize these postponed environmental diplomacy events, because these events are the ones that directly touch the politicians and the governments and the decisions that they make. It's such a simple gesture that we can do. Emails are free, they don't take any time to be sent, and they can really make the difference. Next video is gonna be the third and last one of my trilogy about COVID and environment, and it's the most important one because I'm gonna give the concrete reasons why we should work towards environmental protection. I'm gonna explain why keeping the environment safe is the most important thing that we can do as humankind. For who doesn't know me, hi, I am Mary Jane. I make vlogs about sustainable travel. I am Italian, but at the moment I am in New York City. If you found this video valuable, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and especially click on the bell button to receive the notifications of my next videos. I'll see you. Bye!